On the Issues. The Dean is here. Now we can begin. This is On the Issues, our continuous series of conversations with news and policymakers. But as you know, at least some of you know, that we also use On the Issues as a means of revealing the latest poll results for the Marquette Law School poll. Joining me today is Charles Franklin. Professor Franklin joined the Marquette Law School staff full-time late in the summer. We're delighted to have him here. As you know, he is the director of the Marquette Law School poll. Charles, we'll get right into the numbers today. But first, let's do what we always do when we have one of these events. Let's tell the folks about how many people were surveyed, what kind of survey it was, whether we surveyed cell phones, all that good stuff.
Sure. So this month we surveyed 800 registered voters in the state. We called them by both cell phone and landline. The best estimates for the cell phone population in the state is about 30%. We ended up actually with 32% in this sample, so they're close to where cell phones are. And we use live interviewers. These are not robocalls, and we also use a professional telephone facility. They're not undergrads doing this for extra credit. So I think that's worth it.
Not that they wouldn't do a fine.
No, they do. Wonderful job. But they're too busy doing good in the world otherwise. And there's one thing that we don't usually say at this point, but I think we probably should, and that is to thank the 800 people for taking part in the poll. This is an act of civic participation. It's a way of saying what you think to your fellow citizens in the state. And in that small way, but important way, voters, citizens help inform all of us about what we think in all of its diversity and sometimes puzzling features. So thank you to the 800 people that took our calls. And we should do it next time for those that didn't take the call.
That's right. That's right. We have an awful lot to talk about today. In fact, the press release was 4 pages. Which is a long press release, even by our standards. But we want to begin with the 2014 race for governor. And we'll get to some possible head-to-head matchups in a moment. But first, let's begin with the question that we ask about most public figures, Charles. It's a favorability question. And we're going to ask about Mary Burke, who is now a declared candidate for governor of the Democratic Party. And I guess we'll start there.
Yeah. So the question is, and we ask this of a whole range of political figures and sometimes political organizations as well. Would you say you have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion about the person, Mary Burke in this case, or haven't you heard enough to say at this point? And that's important, and she's a good example of that, a relative newcomer to politics, certainly a very recent entrant into the race. Many voters will not have heard of those folks at the very beginning of the race, and will learn about them to the end. So this is partly to measure favorability, positive or negative favorability, but it's also to measure familiarity, and that percent that say they don't know enough or can't give a rating to the person is an indicator of that level at which they've penetrated the public consciousness. So, here we go. The big number, of course, is over there on the right, the 70% who say they don't know enough about her. I want to tell you now, because I won't repeat it on the others, this combines the roughly 62% who say I haven't heard enough with no category. Now, of the favorable and unfavorables, 3 points more favorable than unfavorable, 17 to 14. That's very typical of lesser-known candidates, and we'll watch to see where this develops. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, when Tammy Baldwin entered the Senate race in January of 2012, her don't-know rate was at about 45% in January. So that's a kind of a measure of a gap between a fairly long-term member of the House of Representatives, but a first-time statewide candidate, versus where you get to by the time you finally reach election day.
And you contrast that, Charles, to the public awareness of someone like Scott Walker. Look at his favorability.
Yeah, you'll see a little difference on this one. Only 4% don't know who Scott Walker is or don't have an opinion about it. And a fairly even balance, 50 to 46 on the favorable, unfavorable measure. This is pretty close to where we've seen the governor through really most of the year. He's been hovering in that near 50, maybe a little above, maybe a little below. For the favorables, the unfavorables have been hovering in the mid 40s or maybe a little bit higher than that sometimes. So this is not a very surprising figure, but I think especially the gap between a sitting governor who has run through a recall election on top of everything else. I will say that 4% is remarkable when you compare it to other governors in the country. There are a lot of governors, even after 2 years in office, that still are only recognized, or that still have a don't know rate in the 20% range, or even in some cases the 30% range. So,
Mary Burke, the former Trek executive and former State Commerce Secretary at Madison School Board member, is the only declared Democratic candidate right now. Senator Kathleen Vinehout, state senator from Alma, is still thinking about it, so she'll make a decision around the first of the year. We also tested her for favorability ratings, too.
And so here she is. So Senator Vinehout is 79% don't know, versus an even split of 10 points each for favorable and unfavorable. I think the comparison here that's worth looking at is that don't know rate. So you have a declared candidate that's 9 points better known than the undeclared candidate. That's sort of what the value of that first week or so or 2 weeks of publicity between the time she announced and the time we did the poll may have bought Mary Burke a 9-point more recognition.
And also tells you how quickly we forget, because Kathleen Vinehout, as you know, was actually a candidate for governor in a recall election in the primary. We also looked at Peter Barca's favorability numbers. He is the Assembly Minority Leader, a Democratic legislative leader, someone who's been in the news a lot, and yet...
Yes. And this is here not because we think he's about to jump in the governor's race, but because it gives you another point of comparison of someone who's not being actively talked about as a particular candidate, to someone who holds, as Mike says, this important office. And 82% say they're not familiar with Peter Barca. So this gives you the baseline of how unfamiliar many political figures are before they enter an active statewide campaign. I think the contrast between Barca at 82 and 79 for Vinehout and 70 for Burke shows you the relative speed of progress in becoming known to voters. But 70% who still don't know who you are simply makes the obvious how much further there is to go.
Charles, let's move on to the job approval rating for the governor and what we have there.
Now, this is an indicator that we watch closely, and everybody watches, but it hasn't moved around very much recently. In this month's poll, it's 49 approved, 47 disapproved, and again, just 4% don't know. Like the favorability that's hovered around 50 for a while, job approval has hovered near 50. It's been as high as 51 and as low as 47. Here's the full set of the governor's approval since he took office. Now here I'm using our polling and every other statewide poll that's available. This month we see a 1-point uptick in approval, but none of this, as is obvious from looking at this, suggests that we're seeing a trend either up or down at this point in the governor's approval ratings.
So let's do a couple of head-to-heads here, and we'll begin with a head-to-head between the declared Democratic candidate Mary Burke and Governor Walker.
Okay, there it is, 47-45. This is a little bit closer than what the Democratic firm Public Policy Polling found in September before Burke had declared. I believe it was a 5 or maybe it was a 6-point gap there, 5 I think. So it's a little bit closer than that. On the other hand, St. Norbert College and the Wisconsin Public Radio poll last week asked a question that wasn't a head-to-head, but was a question of whether Governor Walker deserved to be reelected, and slightly more people said did not deserve reelection than did. So I think we fall right in between those, showing what could become quite a close race at this point, especially with a Democratic candidate that is as little known as Burke is right now. But of course, the challenge of the campaign is how do those numbers move across the next 12 months.
Again, Senator Vinehout has not decided whether she's going to be a candidate, but we did a head-to-head matchup with her too.
Right. And you'd have to check the numbers to really see the difference on the screen. It's 47-44 compared to 47-45 here, trivially within sampling error. I should have said both of these gaps are inside the margin of error for the poll, so essentially a toss-up race at this point.
And Representative Barca.
And for the final comparison, Barca, here gap grows just a little bit to 6 points, 48-42. There are a couple of points to make here. The most important is in light of how few people say they're familiar with any of these three Democrats, and yet they are getting in the mid-40s of vote support. And there's not much differentiation between the three Democrats. They're all pretty close to the governor. What you're seeing is essentially a partisan position on this and partisan alignments, rather than some detailed understanding of the individual candidates and their messages and so on. It's way too early in the process for that. So if we bring up that good word polarization in the state, I think we see the evidence that the state remains evenly divided. The other part of polarization is the passion people bring to their divisions. We'll have more to say about that later.
Let's look at a potential Burke-Walker race through the eyes of the political parties, people who say they're Democrats versus people who say they're Republicans.
Well, gosh, Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats.
So,
yeah, here it is. I believe there is some evidence for that.
Okay.
So I think the left and the right's not terribly interesting, but the behavior of the independents in the middle is more so. And here, Governor Walker has a bit of a lead, 48 to 41% among independents. That is in keeping with some of the results we saw in 2012. Both parties seem to be very strongly aligned behind their candidate. Democrats slightly less so, but still pushing 90% support.
But the numbers move a little bit, Charles, when you ask people to identify themselves by political philosophy rather than a party.
That's right. One of the things from 2012 that became an issue specifically in Ohio was the Romney campaign was saying, we're winning independents in Ohio. You can't win independents and not win the state. But there was something else going on in Ohio, and that was with people who call themselves moderates. And so we're looking at that here as well. Here's what happens when you do conservative. Counterintuitively, I put the conservatives on the left. Sorry about that. But among moderates, there's a little bit of a Burke advantage, 46 to 42. So if you're thinking about where are the swing voters in the state, those independents are swing voters that lean a little bit towards the governor. The moderates are swing voters who lean a little bit towards Burke at this point. How that shakes itself out remains to be seen. There's one surprising thing here, and that's among conservatives, where Governor Walker gets 72%, but Burke picks up 21%. Now, I'll confess, that's still a bit of a mystery. The difference is that within the conservative group, people who are calling themselves very conservative are up at the 90% range of support for Governor Walker, as you might expect. But people who are calling themselves merely conservative, that's my word, we don't put that word next to in the question. But people who are just calling themselves conservatives show somewhat less support for the governor right now than you might anticipate. So I think that's a trend to watch and maybe to tease out some of the stories behind as we go through the year.
Something else to watch, Charles, is the gender gap. We see it here in a potential matchup.
Absolutely. Much talked about, and probably no surprise to anyone. Governor Walker leads among men 52-40, and Ms. Burke leads 49-42 among women. A couple of things to say about that. First is think of it as the net gap between those two, in which case among women the Democrat has a +7 advantage. But among men, the Republican has a +12 advantage, right? So we tend to think of the gender gap as all about women going for Democrats or particularly female candidates. But there's the other side of it, and that's the balance among men. And at this point, the men are a little more extreme in their preferences compared to the women. Now, women make up a little bit more of the electorate than men do. And so this is the interesting question of if men and women were split equally and in opposite directions, the slightly bigger percentage of the electorate would mean the gender gap would favor the Democratic candidate typically in that situation. But if you're in our situation where there's more women than men in the electorate, but the men are a little more extreme in their preferences, it's a little more interesting to think about how does this dynamic play itself out. And we see actually, if we go back to the 2012 data across all of the races that we follow, quite a bit of variability in the gender gap from poll to poll, month to month. So an interesting question is going to be how stable is this and how does it move over time?
We're going to spend a couple of moments on the issue of job creation because I think that will be front and center in any gubernatorial race in this state in 2014. We've been looking at how people feel about the performance of our state versus the performance of other states.
That's right. So our question is Wisconsin creating jobs faster than other states at about the same rate, or is Wisconsin lagging behind other states in creating jobs? So in our new data, we see 14% faster, 37 the same, 41 lagging. It's an interesting question of whether you should add faster and the same and get 51%, a slight majority who think we're at least keeping up, right? Or whether you don't want to add those and focus on the 41% that say we're falling behind. But we asked the question in July as well, and really the interesting part is that comparison. So here's the difference between July on the left and October now. And you can see the lagging percentage has come down from 48 to 41. The faster has gone up from 8 to 14, and the same hasn't changed very much, 35 to 37. So over this period of time, a little bit more positive view of faster and a little bit less negative of view on lagging behind.
And Charles, is that I guess we can't say this for certain, but during that time, there was an estimated $800,000 spent on ads by one of Governor Walker's allies, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, which did not talk about the quarterly census numbers, which have the state ranked 34th, that's the most recent number. But they did talk about the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Index, which is a number of indicators which the governor is now citing much more often, which WMC cited in those ads. That has us doing much better. I think second was the latest one. It's a projection of the future, not an examination of the moment, but talking about what will be or what they think will be. That would seem to be the difference, but we can't say that for certain, can we?
Yeah, I think if you make advertising for television, or possibly if you sell advertising for television, you might be tempted to attribute all of this change to that ad campaign. And as someone who's studied campaign advertising, I think there's a decent case to be made for that. Not just because there was $800,000 put behind these ads, but because it was advertising that was essentially unanswered by counter-advertising at the same time. What we find when we look at ads run around the country is that if both sides are advertising, even if they're not at equal volume, at least semi-parity, then we rarely see dramatic shifts in support. But when one side goes dark and the other side has the airwaves to themselves, it's exactly at that moment that we see the biggest movement in public opinion and in voter support for candidates. I point back to the period in 2012 between the Republican primary, which ended with Governor Thompson leading in our poll, and then followed by a month in which he did very little, if any, advertising, while Baldwin's campaign was extremely active. When we interviewed again in September, it was Baldwin ahead. And that's, a case in point where this phenomenon occurs. So I think one side of the story is that lack of counter messaging means whoever is speaking gets people's attention. It's also true that this effect, this shift, happened across the board. Both Republicans and independents showed significant shifts, with the lagging behind coming down a bit and at least keeping up, if not moving ahead, moving up a bit. But even among Democrats, there was some movement in that direction as well. So it is across the board. Now, the last thing is, it could be that advertising really doesn't work, and it's a waste of time to buy ads on television.
As someone who makes a living in television, at least partly, I don't want to hear that.
Well, I'm sure that's not correct. I'm sure that's not correct.
Yeah.
But there could be a real-world effect here, is what I'm getting to, before we attribute all change just to the advertising. The now frowned upon monthly employment numbers have had really quite good values over the summer and early fall. But we seem not to be able to talk about those anymore, because they do have sampling variability. They're, in some sense, unreliable, but they've had pretty good news. We did not get this month's numbers because of the government shutdown, and so we don't know whether the latest month would have continued that trend of good news over the summer or not. But I at least want to hold out the possibility that reality is moving in a more positive direction, and people are feeling that. But those possibilities, real-world persuasion from advertising, are both part of this mix. Neither is the complete story for sure, but it's not possible for us to sort out which is which right now.
Charles, let's look at the economy more generally and how people feel about it. Actually, we've seen a little bit of movement in the last few months. It's not in a positive direction necessarily. No. There seems to be some angst out there.
There does. It's not quite going to hell in a handbasket, but it's not doing real well. So this is looking ahead at the economy over the coming year, and whether you think the economy will get better, stay the same, or get worse. And our October numbers over here on the left, 32 better, but 29 worse. Compare that to July, when it was about the same, 31 better, but only 20 worse. So there has been a bit of an uptick of 9 points in seeing the economy likely to do worse. Now, it's fair to remind you that this is less than a third of the electorate that sees that, but when you see movement in that indicator, it is cause for some concern. Now, we're in the field doing these interviews really right after the government shutdown, and national polling showed that over the course of October, during the shutdown, economic pessimism seemed to rise in the country as a whole. So in that, our results are well in line with what the national polling has shown on this. Not by any means a massive panic, but some reason for concern.
Spend a couple of minutes on some key policy decisions that have been made in Wisconsin public policy. And we're going to begin with a couple of the tax cuts that have occurred in the state. Most recently, the one that was passed, the $100 million in property tax relief.
That's right. The intro to this question said, as you may know, the legislature passed a number of policies in the last few months. For each of these, would you say whether you favor or oppose this policy? So, a recent tax cut of $100 million, pretty popular. 56% favor that tax cut, only 36% oppose. Let me tell you ahead of time, we're going to go through these from the ones that are most favorable for the governor's position to those that are least favorable. So you can watch how they change as we go through these issues.
The second tax cut was the one that was part of the budget, the $650 million income tax cut.
I'm going to say one more methodological thing before I move on. On this and on lists of candidates and on the trial heats, you should know that we randomize the order in which those questions are asked for every respondent. So before we start to ask the first of these policy questions, the computer randomizes the order. So people are not always presented with the same question first and then second and then third, but it's a scramble of those things. And that's just a way to ensure that the order in which we bring things up doesn't have a net effect over the course of the whole survey, because everybody is getting different random orders of the question. So, $100 million for your property taxes is good. $650 for income taxes is also good. Not quite as good. 56% like the property tax cut, 52% like the income tax cut. But both, by healthy margins, more support than opposition to these two large tax cuts.
Another policy decision that was made was to expand the school voucher program and make it a statewide program. How do people feel about that?
And this, of course, was a policy that evolved over the course of the year. When we asked about this in the spring, people were more favorable for expansion, but there were some reservations about how broad the expansion would be. What we see now that it's all said and done is 50% favor the expansion of vouchers statewide, 44% are opposed to that.
Do you have any sense of whether that's, you have a difference in opinion of people in the Milwaukee area who have grown accustomed to vouchers as opposed to people outstate who are seeing this for the first time?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head.
Probably in the data.
It's definitely in the data. It's just not up here.
Talk about the idea of borrowing nearly $1 billion for highway construction in the state.
People like borrowing when they think about it for a while. Not by a lot, but a little bit. 49% favored, 44 opposed. But the interesting part here is people were more skeptical of this policy when it was just a proposal in the legislature in the spring, where we saw a flip to that with people more unwilling to borrow money for roads compared to now that it's done. Pretty even split, but a touch more people in favor of that.
Another hot-button issue was the end to the residency requirements. So municipalities could not require their public employees to live within that municipality.
Right.
How do people feel about this one?
This is another one we see a little bit of a flip on, though not by much. 45% approved of ending the residency requirement. 49% were opposed to ending the residency requirement. This one had also been close in the spring, but close in the opposite direction, a little more support for ending residency than for continuing it. So again, like the previous one, pretty close to an even split, but with just a little bit of the balance on the opposition side here.
There's been some new abortion legislation in the state of Wisconsin. We'll talk about this ultrasound bill that was approved and how people feel about that.
Yeah. So this is, do you favor or oppose requiring an ultrasound prior to an abortion? And that one's pretty strongly opposed when it's asked in this form. 38% in favor, 56% opposed. As far as I know, this is the first poll on this specific question in the state. It was a question in September that simply asked about whether you approved or opposed the recent abortion legislation. But it didn't say anything about whether that was pro-abortion, anti-abortion, or what the content was. So this is the first time we've seen this particular issue addressed in a poll here in the state.
As most of you know, the governor decided not to accept federal money for Medicaid expansion in the state. He said he thought he could do it better himself, and wasn't convinced that the federal government would end up having the money available for the program. So he turned it down. Some Republican governors have accepted it. What do people think about that decision?
Yeah, this is interesting. Ohio is going through this right now, where Governor Kasich, another class of 2010 Republican governor, accepted the money. Pennsylvania is going through something that looks a little more like what Governor Walker adopted here. And so there are varieties of approaches to this among governors. But here it's not very popular. 36 in favor, 56 opposed. Now, to be fair on this question, and in some sense all policy questions, the gap between your impression of a position and a detailed policy analysis is, of course, quite wide. And so I think it's an open question, and we aren't able to measure it very well here, of how many people are aware of the details that more people below the poverty line are being covered, but some 92,000 between poverty and 130 some odd percent of poverty are being pushed into the Obamacare exchanges. And that's a very convoluted policy question. So we decided in the end to just ask it as straight up as we could about whether this expansion for those just above the poverty line was something people favored or opposed.
It was just 7 years ago when this state, the voters of this state approved a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. 7 years ago. We have been polling on this question, Charles, on several occasions over the last year or so. We saw something in this poll that we had not seen, I think, in polls before.
That's right. For the first time, we turn up a majority in favor of recognizing marriage. 24% favor a civil union but not marriage, and then we're down to 19% who say no recognition for same-sex couples legally at all. If we go back to the last time well, not quite the last time, but a full year ago, to October a year ago, just before the presidential election, those numbers were 44% in favor of marriage then, 28 civil union, and 23 opposing any legal recognition. Again, this is movement that's very much in line with national polling that has not only shown a long-term steady trend, but has seemed to show some noticeable increase in the rate of acceleration of support for marriage over the last year and a half. And this is the first time we've seen a sample here come in over 50%.
We asked a question about the proposed Kenosha casino, which still is being discussed, and there has been no final decision on that. The governor's taking a long, hard look at it, he says. How do people feel about another casino in Wisconsin?
Mixed.
Yeah.
41% favor, 38% opposed, and 19% say, I don't know. So this is one where, from a public opinion point of view, it's very clear that the public is divided, and a big chunk really haven't thought very much about it.
Let's move on to 2016.
Let's mention the regional thing.
Okay,
So we did break it down by region, and the strongest support comes from the Milwaukee area, not including the city of Milwaukee, and the strongest opposition is from the city of Milwaukee. So perhaps not counterintuitive there at all, but that difference does show up in the data.
All right, 2016. Look at some numbers, and this is obviously very, very early in the process, but let's talk about a GOP presidential primary in Wisconsin in 2016. There's a whole bunch of people talking about running. Some not talking about it, but speculated that they may be running. What do you have for us?
So to be clear, the people who are included in this question are people who either call themselves Republicans or say they're independent, but then say they lean towards the Republican Party. Okay? Pure independents are not included in this, and nobody,
So
no Democrats are included in it, and then we'll flip it around for the Democrats in a minute. So this is somewhat interesting. Governor Walker now leads the pack with 29%, with Congressman Ryan a close second at 25. But then there's a pretty sharp drop-off to Senator Rubio at 9, Governor Christie at 9, Senator Paul at 8, and then Senator Cruz at 4, and former Florida Governor Jeb Bush at 2%. And that's a noticeable uptick for Governor Walker, who, when we asked this in May, was in 3rd place, and has vaulted from 3rd to 1st place in the intervening period.
Somebody like Senator Rubio, on the other hand,
has come down quite a bit. How much of that is due to visibility? How much of it's due to political issues in the meantime? His support for the immigration bill, for example, his relative absence from the budget debate. Hard to say. Mm-hmm. And at this point, there's still plenty of time for things to change.
Let's look at the potential Democratic candidates in 2016.
Here, there's really only one story, and that's Hillary Clinton. This has not changed appreciably since May. If anything, she's just slightly higher now than she was in May. But it's Clinton, and then it's the rest of the field. Something could change over time. She could change her mind or not decide to run. I suppose it's of modest interest that Senator Elizabeth Warren is on a par with Vice President Biden in this group, but neither of them are much above single digits, so much time to wait here.
We did a potential head-to-head with several of the Republican candidates. Let's begin with a Governor Walker-Senator Clinton matchup.
Clinton leads. That will be a repetitive story. She leads in all of these 4 matchups that we're going to show you, but by somewhat different, a little bit different margins. So against Governor Walker, it's Clinton 53 and Walker 41, 12-point margin. She led him in the spring as well.
Paul Ryan?
A little bit tighter. Clinton at 51 instead of 53, and Ryan at 43 instead of 41. So a couple of points, 4 points total in the gap that's shaved off, but with still a Clinton advantage.
New Jersey Governor Christie.
Someone who had been a little bit higher in our May poll for the primary has dropped off in that and is now 10 points behind Senator Clinton, or Secretary of State Clinton, I guess.
I know I can't.
Having a little trouble remembering which office I should.
The government shutdown, a debate over health care.
A newcomer to the field, but in Iowa this past week for, I believe, the 3rd time. It's beautiful in Iowa this time. So this is Clinton 55, Cruz 33. Substantial lead, and Cruz is, despite all of the visibility he's had among those of us that watch politics all the time, is still a newcomer to politics to an awful lot of voters. So a lot of people are just beginning to develop their first impressions of him.
Do Republicans in the state, or people who lean Republican, Charles, want to see Scott Walker or Paul Ryan run for president?
Now this was one of the questions that we did not ask in May, so it comes from thinking a little bit about that. Do people want to see either or both of these people, local candidates, run for the presidency? And the answer is pretty much. I should say again, we're talking about Republicans here now, so I'm not looking at Democrats in this group. 52% would like Walker to run, 43% would prefer that he not run. And for Congressman Ryan, it's a bigger 64% run, 27% not run. I'll point out the seeming paradox here. More Republicans would like to see Ryan run, and yet Walker was the first place candidate in the primary. So I scratched my head for a while about that. And it turns out the difference is the somewhat smaller group of people that want Walker to run overwhelmingly have him as their first place choice for a candidate on the primary. Though the bigger percentage that would like to see Ryan run are more distributed across several candidates in their preferences. So the 64% here is spread a little more thinly, and that's the story behind how is it that you get this gap here, but Governor Walker a little bit ahead of Congressman Ryan.
As we mentioned at the beginning of this program, it's a pretty extensive poll, and we're just going to take a moment or two to talk about one of the other areas that we explored, and that is the government shutdown, how people feel about the respective parties because of it, maybe even a question about health care reform and the public's attitudes towards Obamacare.
Right. Well, the first part is people didn't like the shutdown. Golly, imagine that.
Some people did, but the majority.
Yeah, when we asked if people favored or supported shutting down the government in an attempt to stop health care reform, only 19% supported that. 76% were opposed to it. And that's very much in line with what we're seeing in national polling. Now, it's interesting that at the same time, we asked people whether they, on balance, had a favorable or an unfavorable view of health care reform. And here, like a lot of places, more people are unfavorable to the reform still than favorable to it. 42% said they favored it, 48% said they did not. So the point here is that despite there being a little bit of a balance of opinion that remains and has been skeptical since 2010 when the bill first passed, that did not prevent an overwhelming majority of people opposing the government shutdown.
What impact did this have on the parties, Charles, based on what we see in the poll?
Yeah, there are a couple of interesting questions, and I'll take license to speculate just a little bit here. One is that those Hillary Clinton versus the four Republicans, in every one of those four, she does a little bit better now than she did in May, the last time we made the matchup. Now, maybe that's because of the shutdown, maybe it's something else, but it's interesting that it's consistent across the four candidates. When we ask people, do you approve or disapprove of the way Democrats are handling their job in Congress or Republicans handling their job in Congress, the Democrats have a lofty approval rating. Let me see if I can find this extremely small number. Help me.
33.
33, yes, 33. But for 33% approve of how Democrats in Congress are doing their job. 17% approve of how Republicans are doing. Again, very much in line with the public opinion polling here. And I think consistent with the view that whatever the merits of health care reform, the tactic and the strategy has not garnered much in the way of public support.
And maybe that's a good place to end with one final thought, because I think it's something that you noticed, Charles, in this poll that has been unlike other polls, and that is when you ask people, are you certain to vote? We see something here that we've not seen in other polls.
Yeah, because of differences in demographics, maybe in terms of political activation, Republicans are almost always a little bit more likely to say they'll vote than Democrats are. But in this poll, it's reversed. Republicans are lagging in saying they're absolutely sure they'll vote next November behind Democrats. And that, I think, gap is unusual. We don't typically see it in polling. And it's coming right on the heels of the shutdown, a negative view of the party in Congress, frustration about legislation and conflict and so on. So it looks like this may be having some effects. We also see it, I won't go through the numbers, but Senator Johnson's approval rating has fallen since we asked it in the spring. Senator Baldwin's approval rating has risen during that period. And again, knowing that that's, or attributing that to the shutdown is a leap, and I'm not saying that I think it's entirely due to that. But if you compare on turnout, if you compare on enthusiasm, you would see a little bit about that. Oh, the thing about party identification.
I was going to ask you about that, because there'll be some people who say,
Yeah.
well, maybe that's just a reflection of who you sample.
That's right.
Yeah.
Our sample is 32% Dem, 28% Republican, which is almost exactly where it stood for quite a while now. The one little bit of difference is the independents who lean to a party are normally in our samples almost exactly evenly balanced. There's really not an advantage one way or another. In this particular sample, there's a 4% net advantage to the Democrats among those leaners. So we end up with a sample which includes leaners. That's 4 points more of a gap between the parties than what we would typically see. It could just be random sampling variation, but the fact that it leaves the solid partisans unchanged from what we normally see would be consistent with the notion that people who are not strongly attached to their party are now a little less likely to lean Republican and maybe a shade more likely to lean Democrat.
And Charles, I think...
But how lasting this is a big question. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and I think there's some evidence that there are fewer of those really solid partisans than people might think. I think we asked a question about, have you voted for, different parties, candidates from different parties? What, 60% or something? So
Yes.
Yeah, they've done that.
Yes. Interestingly, we have an embarrassment of riches here. I should say, the full questionnaire is online at the law school website. You can read all the questions, see all the answers, dig as deep as you want. So all of this stuff is out there to entertain you. But we asked two questions, actually. One is whether you think the greater polarization in Washington is because the public is more polarized, or whether you think it's because of the election, the elected officials and not the electorate. Well, more people say it's the officials, not the electorate, though it's not an overwhelming gap. It's 50-something to 40-something, I think. Then we asked, over the last few elections, have you found yourself always voting for the same party, or have you voted for different parties? And close to 60% say they have voted for different parties over the last few elections. Now, how consistent that is an open question, but as we explore this issue of polarization as an ongoing concern here in the law school, and work we're doing with Craig Gilbert from the Journal Sentinel, who's a fellow at the law school this year, a Lubar fellow in public policy, that question of how polarized we are, what explains that level of polarization, and an interesting little distinction between, suppose we have two parties that are almost evenly balanced, as you see in some of our data today. Does that mean they're also polarized by definition? Or are they only really polarized if they're evenly balanced and very far apart? And so that's one of the things that this question is getting at and that we'll be exploring in upcoming work.
Let's take some questions in our remaining time. Just please raise your hand if you're in the seating pool. Just press down on the rim, not on the button, but on the rim. Keep your finger down on it. We'll be able to hear you. Any questions? Let me start back here. Yes, sir.
Can you explain the components that go into your undecided or more importantly, the margin of error?
Oh, the margin of error? Sure. Margin of error is largely a function of the sample size. The bigger the sample, the smaller the margin of error. The basic formula is 1 over the square root of the sample size. So if you can punch that into your calculator, you can get an approximation of what the margin of error is. There are some bells and whistles. If we were sampling, say, a high school class of 200 people, and we sampled 100 of them, the fact that we had interviewed half of the class would shrink that margin of error a little bit. But when we're interviewing 800 people out of 3.1 million registered voters, that fraction is so tiny that it makes no difference. So those are the main things that go into margin of error. Smaller groups, if we break things down by men and women, for example, obviously you've got roughly half in each of those groups. So the margin of error for the subgroups gets a bit bigger.
Other questions? Just keep your finger down on that. Right here.
You mentioned obviously there's a gender gap. Historically, is that kind of what's been just normal with Walker? I mean, because obviously, what was the Barrett number with women versus Walker number in 2012 and 2010?
In 2012, we saw a fair bit of fluctuation in it, and that's why I warned you when we talked about it that this may not be the most stable indicator. But there is one thing that does tend to stabilize it, and that is that the gender gap is often interpreted as women being different from men in their preferences for candidates. But it's also women being more likely to think of themselves as Democrats rather than Republicans. 28% of men and 28% of women call themselves Republican. There's no difference there. But when it comes to Democrats, it's 35% of women who think of themselves as Democrats. Only 29% of men think of themselves as Democrats. So imagine you have two groups, but one has, a significant percentage more Democrats in it. Well, that group's going to vote more Democratic, but it arguably is because of their partisanship, not because of their gender. A side issue is whether it's something about their gender that made them choose the party. So this is not trivially easy to sort all this out. But when you compare male Republicans with female Republicans and their vote choices, the women Republicans are only a couple of points more likely to support the Democratic candidate than the male Republicans are. So it's a very modest effect there. It gets bigger among independents, and then it typically gets a little bit smaller among Democrats. So the bigger effect of gender as gender comes when we look at it that way.
Other questions?
Charles, this poll you said was done on registered voters. The last one you did in recall, was that on registered or on likely voters?
So this is a slightly complicated answer. We always sample registered voters, so the base sample remains the same every time we do it. But as we come close to an election, we start reporting the results for likely voters in addition to the results for registered voters. Okay? Now, there's some very nice research showing that people are not terribly good at telling you how likely they are to vote a year out or even 6 months out from the election. And that has led in the polling world to a significant skepticism about using likely voter samples all the time. And quite a near consensus, let's say, that likely voter results are really better reported once we're into the fall campaign, or if it's a primary, the run-up to it. So we will certainly be reporting likely voter results down the road, but we don't report them when we're so far away from the election to do that. However, if you're really curious, it's in the crosstabs. You can go dig it out on the website.
Other questions?
Do you have a general feel for people's interest in politics? And maybe even specifically, I was a poli-sci major here at Marquette.
Yeah.
What's happening in the poli-sci department regarding politics and people's interests?
Well, not surprisingly, in the poli-sci department, people are very interested in politics.
Are the numbers increasing or decreasing with people in that major?
Well, this one's a hard one to go with. Political science is generally a fairly popular major across universities, and that's true here. I don't know the exact number, but I know from talking to the chair of the department recently that it's one of the larger majors on campus. At Madison, it's, along with psychology, either number 1 or number 2 each year. So large majors there. That's partly people's interest in politics. It's also that most of these departments don't have a stats or math requirement.
Got it.
Though clearly they should, right? I'm sorry, I just
Right
couldn't
track,
hear.
wrong track. no.
Oh, you know, we don't ask the right track, wrong track. And we asked it once in January of 2012. And the reason we didn't ask it, and this is controversial, but why is it the right track or why is it the wrong track? And the problem here is that the partisans are very good at blaming the other guy for why we're off on the wrong track, right? And so if you're a Democrat, you can blame the Republicans in Congress for us being on the wrong track. If you're a Republican, you can blame the president for putting us on the wrong track. This was a question that had tremendous popularity with pollsters in the 90s and the late 80s as an important indicator for whether the mood of the country was going to turn against the incumbent. But the track record after 2001 has not been as convincing on this. And I think it's partly because of the polarization in which both parties, especially with divided government now, have good reason to be angry about something and think we're headed in the wrong direction. So we made a deliberate decision to instead ask these more objective questions about the direction of the economy and whether it will get better or worse, whether you personally have recovered from the recession or not. Those kinds of questions where people maybe are not quite as driven by their partisan spectacles, but may base these things on things that are a little closer to home. But there are plenty of pollsters that still ask the question. It's easy to watch on at least national polls, and it's a pretty miserable indicator right now. Nobody thinks we're headed in the right direction.
And briefly, Charles, we in some past polls during the heat of the election years, we asked questions about who do you think cares more about people like me? We didn't do that in this one. What was the rationale for that?
Space. Space, and also the fact that at this
So far
point,
out.
well, it's so far
You don't know
out.
enough about what they care about.
If 70 or 60%, well, 70% don't know
How would you?
who Mary Burke is, asking whether she cares about people like you seems a little on the premature side. On the other hand, it certainly won't be premature as we get into the campaign. In fact, I'm kind of a supporter of that question. One of the things that we've heard a lot, especially from people outside of southeastern and southern Wisconsin, so bring Madison into that envelope, south central Wisconsin anyway, is a lot of comment from people in more rural areas saying, we don't think people in Madison care about us and our situation. And that seems to be fairly bipartisan, that we're just sort of ignored out here. So the cares about people like you, I think, can be an important thing. We saw it in the Senate election really strongly last year, where both candidates started out being seen as caring about people like you. But by the end of the race, even though both Baldwin and Thompson were upside down, both of them were seen more unfavorably than favorably by Election Day. Thompson's cares about people like you had dropped substantially, whereas Baldwin's had not changed at all. And so I don't want to say that's the only thing that was going on in the race, but in a race in which the negative messages that both campaigns used clearly worked. Voters said Baldwin's too liberal. They said Thompson is out of touch with Wisconsin. They didn't like either of the candidates. But on cares about you, even though people had come to not like Tammy Baldwin, they still thought she cared. And so that's the interesting specificity of message, that if you target someone with a message, but it leaves intact this other valuable part of their image, then that plays well. But there are other things. It doesn't have to just be that. Strong leader, credible leader. So we'll get into those, but not until the candidates have had a little more chance to introduce themselves and shake out the race.
We'd be asking about a primary if there is one, or even if there isn't.
Well, if there is one, I'm sure we'll ask about it, but that still remains to be seen. The other development that's happened since we started planning the poll, of course, is we'll have an Attorney General's race, but way too early to try to ask people about that race.
I think we're going to wrap things up there. We'd like to encourage you to go to our website, law school website, and check out the poll for yourself. As Charles said, it's all there for you to peruse and determine if you think we're full of it or not. But we hope that you'll come to the conclusion we're not. And I'd also like to encourage all of you to attend some of our remaining On the Issues events for this year. About 4 or 5 of them listed on our website. You're welcome at them. The next one that we have is actually November 5th. I'm afraid that one is sold out. Expecting a big crowd for our economist, Raj Chetty, who is doing some very interesting work on economic mobility. That one is packed already, so don't bother if you haven't signed up already. But there are several others that we hope you'll attend. So again, thanks very much for your time, your interest, and your attention. See you next time.